The fluorescent lights of the Rayburn House office building flickered once, a tired hum that seemed to match the weary mood of the press corps gathered in the hallway. It was just another Tuesday in Washington, a day that had begun with the usual drip of press releases and ended with the predictable jousting of party spokespeople. No one in that corridor knew they were about to witness a moment that would shatter the internet, generating over 15 million views before the next sunrise. No one knew that within hours, a 5-second clip of pure, righteous fury would be looped millions of times, turning a routine political exchange into a global referendum on faith, race, and the soul of the American experiment. The hook came first. It always does in the viral age. At exactly 2:14 p.m., a C-SPAN producer named Marcus Chen was doing what he always did during lulls in the hearing, scrolling through the backup feed, making sure the angles were clean. His earpiece crackled with the director's voice. "Stay on wide shot 2. Johnson's about to speak." Chen obeyed, but his eyes drifted to the monitor showing camera 3, a tight shot on Representative Jasmine Crockett, D, Texas. She was listening to Speaker Mike Johnson, RLA, with an expression of polite, professional detachment. Chen had seen that look 1,000 times. It was the look of a member waiting for their turn. Then Johnson spoke, and Chen's hand froze over the switcher. "Madam Speaker," Johnson began, his voice carrying that particular blend of Southern politeness and legislative authority he had perfected over decades. He was responding to a question from a reporter about Crockett's recently announced bid for the U.S. Senate in Texas. The question had been innocuous. Did the speaker have any thoughts on the Texas race? What happened next was not innocuous. Johnson chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that carried through the microphone. "I'll tell you, I am absolutely delighted that Congresswoman Crockett is running for the Senate in Texas," he said, his smile widening. "I think it's one of the greatest things that's happened to the Republican Party in a long time." He paused for effect, letting the laughter of a few GOP aides in the background fill the silence. "The people of Texas are wise. They're going to elect another Republican senator because they understand the values of this state are conservative values. They believe in faith, family, and freedom." He leaned into the microphone, his eyes scanning the room, but deliberately avoiding the camera that was now fixed on Crockett. "And I have to say, Congresswoman Crockett's brand of politics, well, it's not Texas brand, it's not American brand, it's something else entirely." The room went silent. It was the kind of silence that precedes either a storm or an apology. The reporters in the gallery, who had been half asleep moments before, were now scribbling furiously. Johnson had not used the word directly, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. He was questioning whether Crockett's progressive politics, her outspoken advocacy for racial justice, her very identity as a black woman from Dallas, fit the faith, family, and freedom mold of Texas. The hook was set. Back in her office, Jasmine Crockett was not watching the feed. She was on the phone with her campaign manager, discussing a fundraiser in Houston, when her chief of staff burst through the door, tablet in hand. "Boss, you need to see this." The video was already circulating internally, passed among Democratic staffers with angry emojis and exclamation points. Crockett watched the clip in silence, her face betraying nothing. When it ended, she set the tablet down and looked at her team. "Get me a camera, now." Within the hour, Jasmine Crockett was standing in a small studio in the basement of the Capitol, a simple backdrop behind her, a single camera in front. There was no teleprompter, no prepared remarks, just Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender, a civil rights attorney, a woman who had spent her entire career facing down power on behalf of the powerless. She looked directly into the lens, and in a voice calm as glass and sharp as a blade, she began to speak.
"I must say," she said, her words measured, deliberate, "that they act as if they're scared, regardless of what it is that they say. It was a masterclass in political rhetoric. She didn't scream, she didn't accuse, she simply observed. The they was understood, the speaker, the Republican establishment, the entire machinery of a party that had just tried to define her out of existence. And in that one sentence, she flipped the script. Johnson's mockery wasn't an attack, it was a confession of fear. She continued, her voice gaining the faintest edge of steel. Texans, frankly, have not had a reason to be excited. It's been the same old for a very long time. She was speaking to the voters now, bypassing the press, bypassing Johnson, speaking directly to the people who would decide her fate. There's something different that people are looking for. I am a different candidate, unlike anyone who's ever run in Texas. The video was posted at 3:47 p.m. By 4:30, it had been viewed 500,000 times. By 6 p.m., it had crossed 2 million. The comment sections exploded. Supporters praised her grace under fire. Critics accused her of playing the victim, but everyone was watching. Everyone was talking. And then, just as the initial wave was cresting, the second wave hit. It came from an unexpected source, the House floor. Later that evening, during a procedural vote on an unrelated agriculture bill, Crockett and Johnson crossed paths. It was a chance encounter, the kind that happens 100 times a day in the Capitol's winding corridors. But this time, a C-SPAN camera was rolling, capturing the B-roll of members milling about before the vote. Johnson, perhaps feeling emboldened by the day's events, perhaps simply unable to resist, approached Crockett. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby microphones to catch it. "I hope there are no hard feelings about earlier. I was just speaking the truth as I see it." Crockett turned. She looked at him for a long moment, and the camera zoomed in. Her eyes were not angry. They were searching, as if she were looking for something in his face that she already knew wasn't there. "Speaker Johnson," she replied, her voice soft but crystalline. "You spoke about faith, you spoke about family, you spoke about freedom, and you used those words to suggest that I, a black woman who has spent her life serving the public, do not belong." Johnson shifted his weight. "Now, that's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said," Crockett interrupted, and now there was fire. "And I want to ask you something. When you look at me, what do you see? Do you see a fellow human being created in the image of God, or do you see a political problem to be solved?" The question hung in the air. Johnson opened his mouth, then closed it. For a full 6 seconds, an eternity in television time, he said nothing. His aides shuffled uncomfortably. Other members nearby stopped their conversations to watch. The camera held on Johnson's face, capturing every micro-expression, the blink, the slight parting of lips, the faint flush creeping up his neck. 6 seconds of silence. Then Crockett smiled, a small, knowing smile, and turned away. She walked toward the floor to cast her vote, leaving Johnson standing alone in the corridor, the silence of his own unanswerable question echoing around him. The clip was uploaded within minutes. The headline was inevitable. Mike Johnson questions Jasmine Crockett. Her response shuts him down. It was a slight dramatization. Johnson hadn't explicitly questioned her faith, but he had invoked faith as a marker of belonging, and Crockett had called him on it. The internet did the rest.
By midnight, the numbers were staggering. The original clip had been viewed 4 million times on X alone. Reaction videos proliferated, political commentators dissecting the exchange, body language experts analyzing Johnson's frozen silence, pastors and theologians weighing in on the nature of faith and political identity. A hashtag #SheAskedHim, began trending globally. The most powerful response came from an unexpected corner. At 11 p.m., a video appeared on TikTok from a young evangelical pastor in Ohio named David Park. He had been a Johnson supporter, he said, had voted for him, had believed in his message of Christian conservatism. But watching Johnson stand there, unable to answer a simple question about seeing the image of God in another person, had shaken him. "I've been thinking about the Good Samaritan all night," Park said, his eyes red-rimmed. The priest and the Levite walked past the wounded man. They had their reasons. They were busy. They had important religious duties. But the Samaritan, the outsider, the one who was supposed to be the enemy, he stopped. He saw a human being. And I have to ask myself, when I look at Jasmine Crockett, do I see an enemy or do I see a neighbor? Because if I can't see my neighbor, I don't think I can see God. The video was shared 200,000 times by morning. As the sun rose on Wednesday, the mainstream media finally caught up to what the internet had already decided was the story of the week. CNN led with a split-screen analysis, playing Johnson's initial delighted comment alongside Crockett's response. Fox News took a different tack, with hosts defending Johnson's right to criticize political opponents, while awkwardly pivoting away from the faith question. MSNBC's Morning Joe played the 6-second silence on a loop, marveling at its power. The New York Times ran a nuanced piece exploring the intersection of race, religion, and politics in the Texas Senate race. The Washington Post's style section covered Crockett's viral moment and its implications for political communication in the digital age. But the most telling coverage came from outlets that rarely intersect with national politics. Black media outlets like The Root and Essence celebrated Crockett's poise. Christian publications like Christianity Today and The Christian Century ran thoughtful essays on the proper relationship between faith and political identity. And the numbers kept climbing. By noon on Wednesday, the combined views across all platforms, YouTube, TikTok, X, Facebook, and Instagram, had surpassed 15 million. International outlets picked up the story. The BBC ran a segment on American political discourse and the role of faith. Al Jazeera explored the racial dimensions. Even outlets in India and Brazil, far removed from the intricacies of Texas Senate races, found something universal in the clip: a powerful person confronted with a simple question and the silence that followed. For Crockett, the moment was transformative. Her campaign reported a surge in small-dollar donations, over $2 million in 48 hours. National Democrats, who had been quietly skeptical of her chances in a statewide Texas race, suddenly found their phones ringing off the hook with donors asking how they could help. She was booked on The View, on Late Night with Seth Meyers, on every major platform. But through it all, she returned to the same message. In an interview with a Dallas television station, she was asked about the viral moment. "You know, I wasn't trying to go viral. I wasn't trying to create a moment. I just asked a question. I asked him to see me. And when he couldn't answer, that told me everything I needed to know about the politics of exclusion that have dominated this country for too long." The response from Johnson's camp was muted. A spokesman issued a brief statement. Speaker Johnson has always believed that all Americans are created in God's image. His comments were about political ideology, not personal faith. But the statement felt defensive, a fire hose trying to put out a wildfire. The damage was done, not because Johnson had said something explicitly offensive, but because he had been rendered silent by a question he couldn't answer.
The political implications rippled outward. In Texas, Republican strategists privately admitted that Johnson's intervention had been unhelpful. "We were running against a Democrat in a red state," one strategist told the Texas Tribune on condition of anonymity. "Now we're running against a viral moment that makes us look like we're attacking someone's faith. It's a completely different race." Democrats saw opportunity. The Congressional Black Caucus rallied around Crockett, holding a press conference where members took turns reading the definition of faith from the Bible and contrasting it with Johnson's political usage. "Faith without works is dead," said Representative Ayanna Pressley, Democrat from Massachusetts, "and the work of faith is seeing the image of God in every person, not just the ones who vote for you." The theological debate spilled into the public square. Conservative commentators argued that Johnson had every right to question a political opponent's fitness for office.
Progressive theologians countered that invoking faith as a boundary marker, suggesting that some people's politics made them outsiders to faith, family, and freedom, was itself a violation of Christian teaching. The argument was ancient and new at once, a continuation of the American struggle over who gets to define the nation's soul. By the end of the week, the 15 million views had become 20 million. The clip had been translated into a dozen languages. International newspapers ran profiles of Crockett, marveling at how a relatively unknown congresswoman had become a global symbol of resistance to political exclusion. And still, the silence echoed. For Crockett, the moment was not an end, but a beginning. She returned to Texas and threw herself into campaigning, speaking at town halls, shaking hands at county fairs, appearing at churches of every denomination. She didn't just talk about the viral moment, she lived its lesson. She listened, she saw people, and they saw her back. In a small church in East Texas, a predominantly white congregation invited her to speak. It was a risky move for a Democratic candidate, but she went. She stood at the pulpit and looked out at the faces, farmers, teachers, retirees, young families. She didn't talk about politics, she talked about faith. I grew up in the Baptist church. I learned that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And what I hope for, what I've always hoped for, is a country where we can see each other, not as enemies, not as problems to be solved, but as neighbors, as children of God. That's the faith I'm running on. That's the Texas I believe in. When she finished, there was silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of Johnson's frozen moment, but a different kind, a silence of reflection, of possibility. Then the congregation stood and applauded, not because they agreed with every policy position, but because they had been seen. The video of that moment didn't need to go viral. It was a quieter kind of truth, the kind that builds movements one heart at a time. But it was a direct result of the earlier explosion, the 15 million views, the global conversation, the simple question that had shut down a Speaker of the House. In the weeks that followed, the narrative settled into something like myth. Political science professors would study the exchange as a case study in viral communication. Media critics would analyze the 6-second silence as a masterclass in nonverbal power. Theologians would write papers on the invocation of faith in political discourse. But for the millions who watched, it was simpler than that. It was a moment when power met truth, and truth won. And for Jasmine Crockett, it was just another day in a life dedicated to service. She didn't dwell on the viral fame. She didn't let it define her. She kept showing up, kept asking questions, kept seeing people. Because that, she would tell anyone who asked, is what faith looks like in action. As the sun set on the week that changed her life, Crockett stood on the balcony of her Dallas apartment, looking out at the city she loved. Her phone buzzed with another interview request. She ignored it. For a moment, she just breathed, letting the weight of the week settle around her. She thought about Johnson, standing silent in that corridor. She wondered if he had thought about that moment since, if he had asked himself the same question she had asked him. She hoped so, not because she wanted him to suffer, but because she believed in the possibility of change. That was her faith. That was her freedom. And somewhere, in a living room in Louisiana, Mike Johnson sat in front of his television, watching the news cycle replay the moment over and over. His wife sat beside him, silent. He thought about calling Crockett, just to talk, just to explain, but he didn't know